Hello there, and welcome back to Kraise Gaming Presents Vampyr. This is my end of play kind of final thoughts stroke review of the game itself. Now I've finished a whole run through. I wanted to put forward, kind of my thoughts of the game while I was kind of playing it, recording it, and just so that you guys have an idea of what to expect if you haven't played it before. And if you haven't played it, please, and you haven't seen the video that kind of the videos that complement this particular review, please do feel free to watch my playthrough. I enjoyed it. So first up, I wanted to talk about the graphics. Now the thing about the graphics is, with this particular game, they weren't great, but they actually weren't that bad either. The city of London was very dark and very eerie, and the graphics did well to kind of highlight, the kind of creepy London streets. But it certainly wasn't what I would consider, groundbreaking graphics. Some of the corners were a bit edgy, for example. But on the whole, I thought, the graphics were okay. I'd give them a kind of 7 out of 10. The cinematics that went with them were brilliant. The story of this game was such that a lot of what you were doing was kind of interacting while in a conversation, and while cinematics were going on, and that really did bring the game. I thought that was very, very good of the game. Now the controls of the game left a little bit to be desired, and in some areas really wound me up to no end. The controls are, for the if you've got like an Xbox controller, for example, aren't too bad, but I'm a very much a mouse and keyboard kind of player. I prefer it. I'm just a lot more comfortable with it, unless I'm playing games like Dark Souls, for example, in which case you can't play with mouse and keyboard. But the thing about the controls, especially with mouse and keyboard, is that if you have an enemy targeted, any small movement of the mouse changes target, and there's nothing you could do about it. And so when you go to hit someone, you go to hit them again, but your target changed, so you swing behind you, and then again behind you again, and it was really, really frustrating. So controls for an actual Xbox controller, great. Mouse and keyboard, very, very frustrating. The music of the game complemented the kind of era of the game very well, and the very creepy nature of the supernatural setting of the game. No fault for the music whatsoever. Now, gameplay in general, I have touched on a few bits. The story of the game itself, I thought was very good, very engaging, and I really, really enjoyed it. And it did keep me playing because I wanted to, I just wanted to see where everything went. There was the main missions that you had, and also some very quick side investigations that you had to do per area, and they weren't. They didn't really take you away from the main mission that you were doing. Just if you were there, you could run around and very quickly do a few of the, little investigations that you have. Now that brings me onto the play area. Now the actual map size itself wasn't very big, but they opened up certain parts of it as you went along, which I thought was really good, because even though it was a small play area, there was always somewhere new that you were going, and it didn't take very long to get to places. You didn't feel like you were traveling for ages like you do with some very big open world games. You didn't feel like you needed a horse in this game, put it that way. Now, the enemies of the game, there were 3 main types, variations within those types, but 3 main types. You had skals and humans and vampires, and each of them were spread out throughout the game enough to, and they leveled up with you, and they were spread out within the game enough so that you didn't feel that bored. If you were going from one place to another, it was inevitable you were going to get into some sort of fight, usually with the same sort of creatures. Oh, and you had big werewolves hanging around as well. But there was enough variation that you didn't get bored. If you were needing to go from one place to the other and you just wanted to get there quickly, it was a bit of a ball ache that there was loads of enemies between there and from between here and there, and you knew you were going to get into some sort of fight. So it was tedious in the fact that going anywhere you were going to get into a fight, but they were diverse enough that it wasn't boring for much of the game. Now the combat, my only grudge with the combat of this game was that because you were a vampire, I was hoping you would be able to purely be a vampire, like get rid of the human weapons and just basically use your vampire abilities. Especially with some of the trailers and gameplay videos I saw, there were an awful lot of vampire abilities being shown off. The reality of it, of course, was that on the whole, a lot of the abilities that you had just used too much of your energy to be able to use them more often, especially a lot more than you would have liked, and therefore you were still very heavily reliant on human weapons, which, do you know what, I didn't like very much. If they do a second game, which I hope they do, I hope they go deeper into the vampire abilities and try and steer clear away from the more human abilities. The abilities themselves were actually an awful lot of fun. You did have quite a few different abilities that you could choose, but you could only have 4 at a time and 1 ultimate ability. It would have been a lot nicer to be able to use all of the abilities at once, and then for a bit more variation you could swap them out as and when. But truthfully, if you had all of the abilities with points in so that you could actually use them, truthfully, they're all going to be very low level. Unless you, which I found out later in the game, unless you specialised in a few abilities, there were only a few that you were ever going to use all the time. And so, again, I hope that the next game that they do, if they do another game, they kind of really expand on that and give you a bit more variation on what you can do. Now, as for being a vampire, again, you don't necessarily feel too much like a vampire. Yes, you're stronger, you're faster, you bite things, you've got supernatural abilities. But for most of the time, you're running around with a club or a sword or a gun, and therefore you don't really feel, apart from your movement, because you can shift quite quickly. You blink from one place to another quite quickly. That's really the only thing that made you really feel like a vampire for most of the game. Now the leveling. Which is my final point on this. The leveling of the game did feel very natural. The NPCs within the game are all connected in one way or another. And by talking to one person, you unlock something of somebody else, and they all have, and therefore you can unlock more of the lore of the game and find out a little bit more about the characters as they go along. But leveling was very heavily reliant on eating a lot of the NPCs. Granted, there were a few NPCs that I met straight away that I was like, right, I'm totally going to eat you as soon as humanly possible. And the more you cured and healed the area, and more you heal and cured the NPCs that you were speaking to, because you're a doctor and that's what you can do, the more they were worth. So eating more people meant you had more points to spend on your abilities and level up. But it was a very natural progression. I didn't feel like I was behind in any way. I tried to eat as few people as possible. Crafting and things like that within the game, well, to be honest, it wasn't that big a deal, truthfully. And so, you know, I didn't really spend an awful lot of time. You can level up your weapons, and you can craft, you know, potions and you know, and healing for, you know, the various different types of ailments that NPCs have, like migraines or a cold, or, you know, even a lot of, you know, bronchitis, things like that. And so you were always bashing things and collecting things, but honestly, I didn't really feel that a lot of that was as in depth as perhaps it could, and perhaps something they can look at if they choose to do another game. Final thoughts. Well, do you know what? I did enjoy the game. I'm not going to lie and say I didn't. There are 4 endings to the game. I got not the worst, but not the best. But honestly, I honestly can't be bothered to play the game again. A lot of the intrigue of the game was the main storyline, but now I know the storyline, I'm not really all that fussed to play it again. However, if they do bring out another game, I am more than happy to play it, because I do feel that this game does deserve a sequel. There is a lot of potential within this game that I think they could very much expand on. And so that's it. There are my thoughts for the game. And yeah, thank you very, very much for watching this series. If you haven't watched the other videos that do accompany this, that run through the game, please do. Every single playthrough that anyone ever does is completely different. And I think certainly mine was was certainly as unique as everybody else's. In the meantime, thank you very, very much for listening, and I will speak to you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.